Cool. Then we'll get started then. So yeah, thanks for joining today, and welcome to today's Swigginar on understanding Burp Suite Enterprise Edition. So just a couple of quick introductions. I'm Daniel from the growth team at PortSwigginar. So we work to help existing and new customers get started with our products and also make sure that they're getting value. And to my left is Alex.
Yeah, hi folks, my name's Alex. I sit with the technical support team. So we help customers on a day-to-day basis with our professional and enterprise products. So any technical questions you might submit, come to my team and I'll be taking us through the demo today.
Cool. We've got a couple of people working in the background, Hannah, Adam, James, Maya, and a few other people. They're covering the Q&A facility. So there is a box that's separate to the chat that you can drop any questions in throughout the session. We will try to respond to them during the session, but don't worry if we don't get around to your question. We'll be following up afterwards as well. As mentioned, there will be, as at the start of the presentation, there was a couple of poll questions. We will be popping those throughout the presentation as well, if you answer a couple of others. So just to recap why we're here, as part of your onboarding and your purchase of Enterprise Edition, we want to make sure that you get started successfully. We have been engaging with a number of customers over the last few months just to understand the challenges, the kind of process they're going through to onboard onto the software. And we just want to take you through kind of how to get started today and understand some of the technical requirements around that. If you're going to move on to the next slide. So just in terms of what we'll be covering, as I mentioned, the deployment of Enterprise Edition, so taking you through the options available, drilling down to those from an architecture perspective. And then Alex will be running through a bit of a demo on the foundations around scanning, setting up your sites, etc. And then a couple of points on next steps. So once you've kind of been taken through that, there will be some resources externally that you can refer back to, but kind of making sure you're hitting those prompts as you move through your installation and onboarding. Okay. So just in terms of the architecture and deployment, we'll just kind of touch on those as mentioned. We'll be taking you through the preparing to deploy documentation. So there's a couple of things to consider as you start your deployment. We do have a mix of different customers on the call today, some who may already be utilizing and have an active deployment of Burp Suite Enterprise Edition, and some others may not have taken any action with their license yet, or maybe still working through some of the prerequisites. So just in terms of the deployment, we do have all our preparation guidance on our website. A lot of this was updated last year based on some of the conversations we've had with customers. And that will allow you to settle on your chosen deployment method. As I say, we'll be taking you through the different options available. And then Alex will be going through the architecture for each of those deployment methods. And I'll just help you understand the requirements for that. Typically, a deployment is usually around 2 to 4 weeks. And that, in most cases, is down to delays internally with a lot of our customers around resourcing and just preparing the infrastructure. So if there's third parties involved or spinning up machines or environments to cater for that, we understand that can take some time. So just in terms of the actual deployment methods, there's 2 options available, and these are down to personal preference. A large number of our customers do tend to go for the standard installation. It's the most common option. It can be run on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, as it mentions there. All those downloads are available on our releases page, which you can access on our website. That installation can be done on a virtual physical machine, and also cloud-based services as well. So most customers go for utilizing an EC2 image within AWS, but there are other options available as we'll cover. As part of that, there is a single machine deployment and also a multi-machine deployment. A single machine deployment tends to be used for trials and POCs, and then customers do tend to transition over to the multi-machine deployment depending on the number of scans they've purchased, resources, and also their apps as well. So that'll be the example that we'll be using for today's overview. which is the multi-machine one. If you do prefer or want to use containerization, we do have a Kubernetes option. That is deployed using our Helm chart, so that's available in our documentation. That is designed to be agnostic, so it really enables you to kind of pick whatever provider you want, whether that's a private cloud provider such as AWS, Azure, or a on-site deployment as well. So just in terms of the requirements of that, it does provide you with some flexibility around auto-scaling scanner machines. We typically advise you don't go down the Kubernetes route if you don't have that experience internally. We'd recommend the standard installer. However, if you do have that expertise internally, it's a great option given that flexibility. So just in terms of the system requirements for both of those options, we do strongly advise you check those over. There is a system requirements page on our website, and as part of the preparation guidance, that breaks down all the components that feed into that, and all the prerequisites that you'll need to address, so things like networking, system specs, etc. So no one size fits all for the deployment. As I mentioned, there's the scan consideration. You've also got the type of scans being performed, the apps being scanned to consider. So we do, as I say, strongly recommend that you do read through that, and I can see it's been dropped in the chat there as well for you to refer to. Just on that as well, if you are unsure of any of the articles on the knowledge base, please feel free to contact us at support@portswigginar.net, and we can take you through those just to make sure that you're not or haven't deployed an under-spec machine that may cause issues further down the line. So I'm just going to pass over to Alex now just to kind of run through the architecture for both of those deployment methods that I've covered.
So yeah, folks, we'll just quickly go through the architecture side of things and the various components that make up Burp Suite Enterprise Edition. As you mentioned, we've got the standard installer, which is our kind of go-to option. You're downloading the release from our release page against your chosen OS. Ideally, we do recommend multi-machine setups for production. This just gives us greater performance and scale. So whilst you might be starting small, no doubt you'll grow, and at some point you'll want to start scaling out those scanning machines. So that's the advantage that multi-machine deployments are giving you. We can see here that the enterprise server machine is living with the web server. That will be deployed to one machine. That can be physical or virtual. And then the scanning machine or scanning machines are deployed to their own machines as well. And that just extrapolates out over how many concurrent scans you want to run. And again, that information is included in our system requirements documentation. Now you can use our bundled database, which is a H2 SQL. But once more, for large scale production deployments, we generally recommend an external database. We list what's supported, but the kind of main SQL players are there. And that can do things like fall into your typical backup policy as well. We've got various bits of ingress and egress going on there. So the top one, portswigginar.net, that's required for license activation. You can apply a network proxy to the enterprise server if you don't typically allow access to public networks, but that's for license activation and also how we deliver automatic updates. But we do support offline updates if that's a requirement for yourselves. Then we have the Burp Collaborator. If we've got any Burp Suite Pro users on the call, this is the same service from Burp Suite Professional. Enterprise also utilizes this for out-of-bound type payload interactions. Again, if typically you don't use a public service, that can be deployed privately as well. Then naturally, we've got our target sites to be scanned, which by default are typically be over port 80 or 433. And then our users coming into the system itself, so that they'll access the web server over the specified URL and port, or if your preference is for API clients, that's supported as well. As Dan mentioned, if your preference is around containers, we do support and have the Kubernetes option as well. Try to be as agnostic as possible here. So we provide the Helm chart for the application deployment. From a cluster perspective, you just need to hit these requirements for it to be supported. So some kind of ingress solution, that's going to be a load balancer or an ingress controller. We'll need a persistent volume claim, application-PVC. That needs to be shared by all the nodes in the namespace to which enterprise is deployed. And then for the auto-scaling component that we mentioned earlier, the cluster autoscaler must be installed. So unlike with the standard installer where we kind of pre-provision those scanning machines and they sit there waiting to run scans from the enterprise service direction, we don't do that with Kubernetes. They are spun up as scan jobs are created, either on an ad hoc basis or scheduled. Once the scan completes, those pods are killed off. So if you are deploying this to a public cloud provider, that's got an inherent cost benefit to it. But other than those prerequisites, Enterprise Edition should run on anything AWS Azure, GCP, or a private cluster. Here's the architecture for the Kubernetes side. You can kind of see we've split the responsibilities out. So everything on the right-hand side is what is effectively deployed by the Helm chart. And then you as the customer will be sorting out the ingress, web service, and the database, although we do provide the scripts for setting up the external database based on which database you've chosen. Back to you, Dan.
Cool, thanks. So just in terms of DAS scanning with Burp Suite, so we have a number of different products, and just kind of before we do step into the UI of Enterprise Edition, just cover those. Just thinking about some of the things our customers have mentioned in the journey that they go on with DAS scanning and how our products fit into that. It might be fairly obvious, but it may be something that resonates as we kind of transition through this. If you don't mind, just going to the next slide, thank you. So this just shows kind of the kind of different teams that may utilize DAS scanning and where the applications that PortSwigginar offer fit. So if you follow the journey from the right-hand side, we've got Burp Suite Professional, typically used by pen testers and also security teams, may be used for quarterly or annual pen test cycles or ongoing manual testing. And what we see, or what we've heard from customers, is kind of them transitioning into that middle section there, where they're introducing Enterprise Edition to introduce regular, reoccurring scheduled scans, and that really enables them to scan their portfolio of apps on an ongoing basis. It kind of frees up the security teams to work on other more critical issues, and obviously introduce that kind of always on regular insights into those apps and what vulnerabilities may be there. Pro does still work to complement that. So once those insights have been discovered by Enterprise, people can drill down to those using the other product. And a number of organizations are shifting left as well, just to introduce more integrated DAS scanning into the CI/CD pipelines. So it's a way of capturing issues earlier in the software development lifecycle. So if you have Enterprise Edition, CI/CD is available, integrations available for that, which we'll go into in more detail through the demo as well. We do also have a free offering, which is the Dastardly logo that you'll see there. It's a free lightweight web application vulnerability scanner. So it is aimed at developers to integrate that into the CI/CD pipelines. So if you are using Enterprise Edition but not fully ready to kind of deploy CI/CD into your environment through Enterprise and kind of have that all looped in, it is a good stepping stone for developers to begin using that and catching those vulnerabilities earlier on in the process. We do actually have a CI/CD centric webinar taking place on the 25th of January. So we'll be dropping a link in the chat as well, and that is available on our website to register for as well. Okay. So we'll now over to Alex just to cover the foundations as mentioned.
Cheers, Dan. Okay, folks. So we're just going to go through kind of the foundations of utilizing Enterprise, kind of getting set up with our first scan, maybe taking a look at some results, etc. So I should just log in here. So once we're deployed, we've probably got a few steps that we want to go through before we start scanning, just to make sure we're getting the most out of our deployment. So typically I would recommend customers to get their web server set up and finalized. So you might have gone through some of this in the setup flow when you're going through the application installation. For example, things like uploading a certificate connected to an external database, etc. But if we want to have systems coming in and interacting with Enterprise, which is quite often the case, we'll want to define our web server URL and port in our network settings. So we can flip this from HTTP to HTTPS, which is a very common use case. If we've not already done so, we can upload that TLS cert as well. If we need to configure a proxy server, so as we mentioned around license activation or updates, this is where we would do that as well and add those proxy server details in. Once we've got that set up, we can be confident that other systems can happily interact and access Enterprise. Then perhaps we want to get the team set up. So we do support role-based access control. There's no limit on how many team members you add to Enterprise. And the idea is that we set up our desired roles. Some of those are built in, but we can create custom roles from scratch. So this is effectively what we want our users to be able to see or not see or do or not do. It's fairly all-encompassing in terms of how we apply those permissions or indeed restrictions. And once we've created those sets of roles, we apply them to groups, and then we can add our users to those groups. So for example, if we've got our application structure set up that it's team-based and we only want those teams to be able to see their respective applications, we can restrict that on a role basis. If your preference is more around SSO, so you've got an existing AD structure that you want to pass across, for example, if I jump into settings and integrations, you can see here that we do support SAML and LDAP. So it's just a case of configuring and connecting to those applications. Then we can pass existing group structures across and match those with groups in Enterprise, and they'll just inherit those permissions there. Now, everything within Burp Suite Enterprise is site-based. These are our target applications that we want to scan. You can see here we've got a load already populated in this particular setup, all structured within a folder setup. We're just going to take you through creating a new site from scratch. If it is a new deployment, we do have that bulk import where you can complete the CSV template. My advice would just be to go through creating a new site just so you understand that structure and the kind of detail that we're looking at before you would look to import things kind of en masse. So to create our new site, we give this a name. We'll just call it test for now. Again, we can distribute that into a folder or indeed create a new one. And our first kind of important component is that site scope, so the target of the scan. I'm going to use the example of our own vulnerable web application, the gin and juice shop. So I'll take that URL. And the idea with Enterprise is that we're adding that base URL, which is typically going to be the highest level URL for the application, and all subdirectories will be scanned by default. And that's kind of really the underlying purpose of Enterprise, that we're kind of pointing it at an application, let it discover the content, and then it's going to audit what it's discovered through the crawl. Now, we do have a few more options around that scope. So if I've dropped this down, we've got things like inclusive rules for the URLs, as well as excluding URLs if we don't want to scan a particular part of the application. So just for the sake of an example, if I jump into products here, take that URL, add that to exclude. Now I'm not going to scan that. Inclusive URLs. So maybe there's a part of my application that isn't under this specified path for the main site URL, and again, I can include that in here as part of the scan, or maybe it's an API definition that I want to bring in so I can pass the API endpoints. Now, by default, this is going to be HTTP and S together, but if I have specified a particular protocol, I can select this toggle, and in this example, I'm just going to scan over HTTPS. Once I've sorted out my scope, it's down into the scan settings. So this is going to include our scan configuration. As a new user, I would just encourage you to try out the preset scan modes. So these have all the settings predefined. They're a great way just to get set up and started with your initial scans and start looking at results and learning about the sort of nuances. And this ranges from a lightweight scan, that's going to be capped at 15 minutes, fast, which is still kind of more geared towards speed, but there's no cap. Balance, which is kind of that sweet spot between the scan time and the coverage of the scan, and then deep, which is where we're essentially turning on all scan checks, and we want to get the best possible picture of the security posture of the application. And again, I would just encourage you to try these against either Gin and Juice Shop, which you're welcome to use for initial testing, or your own applications. At a certain point, you're probably going to want to start using custom configurations. So these might just be some specifics that you want to apply in relation to your site. Maybe we're talking along the lines of single page apps where certain settings are really going to give us a benefit, which we will talk about in a second. So if I select this option, I've now got access to that library. So we have some built-in ones here, which just as the description sound, they're geared towards a particular setting. So for example, it could be minimizing false positives. It could be capping the crawl side of things at a particular time. But any custom ones that you make will also be added to this library. You can select that from here. And indeed, I can select different applications and stack them, configurations and stack them together. So that is supported as well. Just note if I am doing multiple configurations, so let's say I do audit checks, passive, and then something like a faster crawl strategy. There is an order of priority, which is bottom to top. So we just want to make sure we're not adding any conflicting configurations in there, but this is covered in our documentation if you want to read more. We'll just delete those and flip back to a preset scan mode. Application login, so if you want to do any sort of authenticated scanning, this is where we'd add that, add this to our application. So we've got two options here, adding username and passwords. So it's a fairly simple login form, single page form, username, password. We can add those credentials here, give it a label. Multiple sets of credentials are supported if we want to try out different users with different levels of access. And then when we locate that form during the scan, we'll submit those credentials. There's also an option in the scan configuration to try dummy credentials and self-registering, that kind of thing. For anything more complex, we would typically recommend our recorded login sequence. So this is a plugin that we have in our browser, a link to which is included in our documentation, or you can click the Learn How It Works button. That'll take you straight to there. And that plugin will allow you to record the process of you logging into your app in an incognito session. It records all of those events, generates a JSON, and then we can add that here. And every time we want to log in, we'll essentially tell the browser to follow this sequence of events. So anything along the lines of SSO, we've got things like redirects or multi-page logins. This is definitely a great option. So in the case of gin and juice, I can give you a quick example. So I've got the plugin installed here. So I do a new recording. That sends me to an incognito session. I navigate to my application. And I want to be as explicit as possible in terms of what I'm doing. No kind of erroneous clicks or navigation, because again, everything will be recorded and then replayed during that process. So in the case of gin and juice, I want to access my account, and then I want to add those credentials, just give some dummy ones for the time being. I would click login. Typically that would log me in and hit the splash page of the application. I can then stop that recording. I don't want to navigate anywhere else because I've logged in successfully. Stop recording. Automatically copied to my clipboard, and there's the JSON. Give that a label and apply. Then again, whenever we want to log in, this will be used by the crawler. Just a quick note to say that this doesn't support multi-factor authentication. So when we perform a scan, we actually log in hundreds, if not thousands of times during the duration of the scan. That's the nature of how we crawl and audit. So as you would imagine, having to pass a dynamic generated code manually for each of those login attempts is a difficult mechanism to support. So we just recommend that you have either MFA disabled or some sort of test account where that's not applied for the purposes of scanning. Next up is extensions. So if any of you are Burp professional users, you'll be familiar with the BAT store and extensions, but these are community created mods, if you will, that change the behavior of the crawler in some way, shape or form. And once you've added extensions to your library, you can select them from here. And again, they're probably going to add something like additional checks that don't form part of the base checks that we make. And we have a lot of documentation if you're interested in creating your own extensions as well. Then we have scanning pools. So this is segregating scanning machine resource. So for example, if we've got different use cases around our kind of day-to-day or weekly scheduled scans, that might sit in one pool. We've got a few scanning machines collated together. And then maybe we're doing some CI/CD based pipeline scans. We can separate those out into a different pool. That way we're not kind of conflating resources between each other. And then finally, scan notifications. So if either we've configured our SMTP server, we can email scan reports to users at the end of each scan, or we can configure Slack, which are scan notifications for scan starting, in progress, finishing, etc., etc. So that's it in terms of the site creation. I do just want to touch on the notion of the API scanning use case whilst we're here, because this is kind of applicable. So API scanning is enabled by default. Any definitions that we discover during the crawl will be automatically parsed. But how do we discover those definitions? So that's going to be based on the site scope and how we've effectively hosted those definitions. So if I just flip to the Swagger website as the example, so this is what we support, OpenAPI specification version 3. So if this was my app, I would take that base URL, and that would probably form my site URL. And then for that application, we have this hosted definition. So it's an edit URL that I can access, and just note the format there, that it's version 3 and in JSON format, which is again what we support for the API definition. So I could take this URL, go back to my scope and add that to included. And this way I'm scanning my application, but also dragging in that definition so I can derive the locations within. And this is effectively how you would set up API scanning. I could just have that standalone definition if that's all I'm concerned with, but typically it's going to be conjoined with the sort of source application, as it were. So that's it in terms of site creation. Once I've created my site, we'll just ignore that for now. Jump into the scans tab. And the idea is that I set up, recurring scheduled scans against my applications. So once they've been created, I get that site tree, and I can select the applications that I want to scan. I can run ad hoc, as soon as possible, run the once, which might be fine for a quick test. But generally speaking, we want some sort of regular cadence for our scanning. So we're going to schedule that and repeat it on whatever desired basis we have. So set it for a particular number of weeks, repeat forever, or until a particular date. And again, we've got those scan summary reports. That's it in terms of kicking off a scan. I'll just do one on an ad hoc basis here. And that will then be distributed to an available scanning machine. And we can monitor the scan if we wish to do so through the timeline. These might be completely no touch, and they're just running in the background. But if you do want to monitor it, you can do so. It'll go through our phases for crawling, auditing, and finished. And we can monitor things like the number of requests being made, the particular URL we're looking at, how many vulnerabilities are we finding once we hit the audit phase. If we jump back into a previously run scan, we can see this one's completed, 3 minutes, 41 seconds against PortSwigginar Labs, which again is another vulnerable website. And then we're starting to build a picture over time of the kind of security posture of that web application. There's a timeline that we mentioned, which has been populated over the duration of the scan. I can look at my specific issues. So these are all categorized as high, medium, low, and informational. That's for the severity rating. And then how confident am I in the discovery of that vulnerability, so certain, firm, tentative, or a false positive that we've marked. And then we can start jumping into specific vulnerabilities at these locations, check out our advisory, look at the issue detail, background info. There'll be some remediation advice as well. A reference to our Web Security Academy, which is a free resource. So this will be more detail on the specific vulnerability, but also a sandbox environment where you can carry out the same kind of payloads. And then our CWB classifications as well. I can view the request for the payload and the response. And if after further investigation, I determine that actually this is a false positive, I can mark it as such. And if I want to propagate that for future scans, i.e. I don't want this cropping up every time because I know it's a false positive, we can mark it for the site or the same URL as well. If I've got ticket integration configured, which again is something typically that comes down the line in the kind of progression journey for building out enterprise, we can do things like monitoring via raising vulnerabilities to tickets. So this one's got Jira configured. I can do this automatically based on the severity and confidence level that we mentioned earlier. So I set that in my Jira settings. It'll just automatically create that ticket for me, or I can do one manually here against a particular project. And then if I want to start sharing things like these results with other teams, other stakeholders in the business, I can look at the report generation, which is effectively that advisory we looked at earlier, but across the board for the whole scan. So I can do summary or detailed. We've also launched some compliance reports. So we've got OWASP top 10 for 2021 and PCI DSS. And then we've also just added our Burp XML reports as well. So again, if you're kind of familiar with the Pro, and you want to ingest this data in kind of third-party aggregation tools, then the XML report is the way to go. That's kind of the 101 of getting your site set up and scanning. We mentioned earlier, once you've kind of got to grips with running scans and looking at reports, etc., you might want to start kind of exploring the custom configuration route. So I jump into settings here. I can go to my scan configuration library, which we mentioned earlier. Here's a lot of the pre-built ones we mentioned. But if I jump into new configuration, it gives you access to every available option for that scan configuration. We've got documentation around all of these options, and I'm not going to go through them all now because there's so many. But if you do want to get to grips with this, we can share those docs, and it explains each option in detail. But again, it's just around tailoring those phases, either just to what you want in terms of time, speed, thoroughness, or maybe there's something very specific about the application that we want to kind of tackle. So just for example, if we're talking single page applications, they typically benefit from a custom config because that dynamic content can be a little bit trickier to crawl and audit. So in that example, I might do things like change the crawl optimization. So from a crawl strategy perspective, more complete or most complete is going to be more beneficial to a dynamic single page application than the others, particularly things like faster or fastest, which one isn't just doesn't have enough time to discover all of the content required, but also typically they do tend to be more geared towards kind of static content rather than dynamic. Also, if I jump into the miscellaneous options here, we always want to do browser-based scanning with SPAs. We're going to really struggle without it, so you can set that to yes, and just make sure you've hit those system requirements to make sure that we can run the browser. Same if we use fragments with our SPA, so we can tell the scanner that yes, indeed, for navigation, we use fragments, so we're probably going to want to set that to yes. And then we have all of our auditing options. So again, this is really just down to your preference in terms of the kind of issues and customization that you're looking at. So for example, we kind of give you broader categories for looking at issues by scan type, but you do have the ability just to look for specific individual issues or sets of issues based on your own preference. And then if there's any particular configuration for connectivity to our apps, so for example, recorded login won't necessarily work very well with things like platform, auth, NTLM, for example. So actually we would add those credentials in a scan configuration. So anything around basic NTLM or digest, add those here rather than using something like the recorded login system, because these occur straight away as the scan starts at the top of the network stack. Same for proxies. So if we need a proxy server to reach our app, this is different to configuring a proxy for enterprise, which is just for that license activation and updates that we mentioned. This will be a proxy from the scanning machine to the target application. So we can add those details here. Same goes for client certs. If we need to talk to the host with a TLS cert, we can add a series of certs and use wildcards to specify those destination hosts as well. And we'll just go through that list every time we want to do a scan. One final thing I've not mentioned there around SPAs. We do have some kind of experimental features in the background. Around the kind of SPA scanning, you're more than welcome to reach out to us for further guidance. And if you are interested in using those kind of experimental based features, those come from Pro as an export, and we can guide you on that. So do feel free to contact us if you need a bit more guidance. So once you've kind of got to grips with the 101 scanning, you've used the preset scan modes, maybe you played around with some custom configurations as well. Again, you're probably looking to build out your integrations further. So we mentioned a few earlier, we've got Jira, GitLab and Trello for issue tracking, LDAP, SAML and Skim for user management. We're going to talk about CI/CD platforms next, and there's a Slack communication one as well. So Dan mentioned we've got the CI/CD specific kind of DevSecOps session coming up. I'd highly encourage you to join that because we're going to go through this information in a lot more detail. But just to kind of give you the basics. For CI/CD scanning with Enterprise at the moment, that's going to be delivered through our driver. So we've got some specific drivers. You can see here Jenkins and TeamCity. They're specific because they're just giving you more of a kind of UI feel, which we'll take a look at in a sec. But if you don't fall into those two categories, don't worry, because we do have our platform agnostic driver, which works under the hood the exact same way. We're doing the same things. It's just a script as opposed to interacting with UI elements. So you can access those drivers from our release page. So you can see the CI/CD driver there. Once that's downloaded and stored on the requisite platform, so I'm going to give you the example of Jenkins. So in Jenkins, I would just go to manage plugins and then add the driver there. And then that's going to give me some additional build steps within Jenkins. And the idea is that I want to insert that into my pipeline so that when I deploy that application, I'm also performing a scan. If I hit a certain threshold that's kind of been predefined in my build step, it'll be failed by Jenkins, and I'll get that report centrally within Enterprise, but I'll also get it here. So from a dev perspective, this is all API driven, so they don't even need access to Enterprise as such, but it is still being centrally recorded from a reporting perspective. So just to give you an example, I'll just log in here. So for this particular project, if I just go to configure, I'll just scroll down to the build steps just to show you that by adding the driver, I've got these new steps: Burp site-driven scan, which is our more modern way of doing it, if you will. It's our most recent addition, and Burp scan, which was our first attempt at the integration, which is still perfectly usable, and we'll discuss why in a second. This is me adding the build step here. So the process is as follows. I want to connect back to that web server URL for the enterprise server at the port. I've generated an API key from an API user. So if I go back to my team, I can see here I've created an API user with the required permissions. So these are all permissions-based, still role-based access control. I can generate multiple API users as well. Once that's configured in tandem with the driver, that'll give me access to my site tree that we mentioned earlier. So this is a site-driven scan. It's already configured in Enterprise with all the required scope and scan configurations, recorded logins, etc. So if I'm a developer adding this to my pipeline, all I need to do is select the application. That's going to give me all the requisite details. I say, well, when do I want this build to fail? So it's going to be based on the severity of the issues that are found and the certainty. So I can set that threshold. I can even permit a certain number of issues. And then typically I'll specify where I want that report to be generated, so I get a local copy. So again, as a developer, I don't necessarily need to be interacting with Enterprise. And once that's all configured, we'll just save that. Anytime I build that project, it's going to automatically scan. So that's sent an API requested scan to Enterprise. If I jump back into my scans here, we can see that's been received. And then as a developer, I can monitor that in the console output and wait for the configuration to finish. Again, if you don't have Jenkins, not to worry, it's just a script process, which is all covered in our documentation. If I just go back here to my dashboard and I'll go to pipeline, configure. And this is what a sample script kind of looks like on a GraphQL side of it. So if you don't use freestyle projects, you tend to use pipelines in Jenkins or elsewhere. And this is what a typical command is going to look like. But the process is the same. We're connecting back to Enterprise. We've got our API key, site-driven, so we specify the site and all that configuration detail is included. Now, if you want to be a little bit more, let's say, dynamic, i.e., I don't know what the site URL is potentially until I deploy it. I don't know what configuration I want to use yet. So I don't want to do the site-driven kind of predefined setup. That's what the burp scan option is used for that we mentioned earlier. So we're just echoing the URL as part of the pipeline build that we want. We can also pass configuration options in JSON format within the pipeline as opposed to dragging that all out of Enterprise. So that's another option available to you as well. And that's kind of it, folks, in the foundational sense 101. Unless I've missed anything, Dan, you think that covers it all?
There was a question around API scanning as well, just in terms of some of the other aspects of that book.
Have you got that question up there?
Yeah. Yeah, just related to API authentication and scanning APIs.
So for authentication, if it can't be covered by things like the creds that we mentioned earlier, or recorded login, a lot of APIs are typically accessed via an authorization header. So we do have a facility to pass a custom header. Currently, that is exported as a configuration from Burp Suite Pro. We are in the process of adding that natively to Enterprise, but if you need access to that or need any guidance on the process, just contact us at support, and we can send you the steps or even a example configuration for you to use as well.
Great, so thanks for that. So just in terms of kind of looking ahead and from all the things that Alex touched on there, if I could just get to the next slide. So just kind of moving forward. So as I mentioned at the start of the session, there's a number of kind of customers at different stages in their journey of deploying or using Enterprise Edition. So not all of these steps will apply. Obviously, if you've not deployed yet, as mentioned at the start, we do strongly recommend you do read through the preparation guidance. There are a number of videos also on our YouTube channel that kind of do take you through. Those are a bit more kind of bite size as well, and you may prefer watching a video rather than reading through the documentation. And there is someone kind of taking you through that particular topic on the video. If you have deployed, we do still recommend checking those steps, those system requirements, sorry, just to make sure that your machine isn't under spec and kind of cutting down on any potential technical issues that you may encounter as you start running scans. So yeah, once you are in the product, obviously kind of get scanning and obviously start to build a picture of the vulnerabilities in your apps. As Alex used in the demo today, we do have the Deliberate Vulnerable website, Gin and Juice, so you may want to choose that to run your first scan before onboarding your own. It's just an option that's available, and it will kind of give you that detailed results. And yeah, you can obviously start to begin to share those results and remediation steps for your developers, either through the report share settings that Alex demoed, or alternatively, if you do go down that CI/CD pipeline route, they are there. And yeah, just to kind of reiterate, we are here to support you as part of your deployment and also as you start kind of onboarding your sites and running your scans. So if you do have any issues, you can contact us at the email address just there. Alternatively, as I mentioned, there are a number of guides on our support center, which will be pasted into the chat, and also we will be keeping the session open now, just to give you an opportunity to ask any other questions over the next kind of 10-15 minutes. So we'll still be here to answer any kind of lingering questions. So yeah, just in terms of kind of closing out, thanks for your time today and joining us. Hopefully the demo was really useful, and yeah, is going to enable you to kind of get things kick-started. And yeah, just feel free to reach out if you do have any questions. And thanks for your time.
Thanks all.